Upon Smite's 9.7 mid-season update, Hi-Rez introduced 4 brand new Tier 3 items to the game. These items came in the form of various different earrings: Fey Blessed Hoops, Manticore Spikes, Sphinx's Bauble, and Griffin Wing earrings. One of these items would be at the forefront of controversy and community discussion. My name is Black Eye, and this is the controversy surrounding Sphinx's Bauble. Before going into the controversy, I think it's important to explain what the item does, as well as events that transpired after the item's release. When they announced the item, the stats it provided had 55 physical power, 80 magical power, 30 MP5, and 10% cooldown reduction. The controversy starts at the passive, because the passive allowed the cooldown reduction cap to be increased from 40% to 60%. It also provided a debuff where your damage and healing output was decreased by 20%. So essentially you could spam more abilities, but they would do less. When this was announced, people were very skeptical, as they believed that increasing the cooldown cap from 40% to 60% would quite literally break some gods. And break some gods it did. In fact, it broke every god. This was because upon initial release, this item was actually bugged. At 1 PM, the same day that the patch dropped, they had to remove cooldown-based match of the days. Not only did they have to remove those game modes, 2 days later they removed Bauble entirely. This is because of a few issues that were discovered. In custom games, you could quite literally just get 100% CDR. All you had to do is just set the base cooldown reduction to 80%, buy Bauble, and then an item that gave 10% CDR. I'm assuming this worked the same way in the match of the days, which is why they were removed, but I don't have confirmation on that. There's another bug where you could buy Bauble, sell it when you were dead, and that would allow you to keep the 20% cap increase without any downsides. And finally, dying with Bauble reset the overcapping, so you could hit very close to 100%.
Streamer caught cheating okay. I don't know. I literally don't know what's happening. Dude, I don't know. I literally do not know. My ult's on a 10-second.
All of these issues combined caused Hi-Rez to remove the match of the days and Bauble entirely. There was already skepticism about how Bauble would fit into the current game balance, and let's just say that the item being very bugged on release didn't really help. 2 weeks later, on July 26th, Bauble was brought back into the game. Obviously, what I just talked about were bugs that didn't really have an impact on balance because they can be quickly fixed. But when it was brought back is when the controversy really started. Immediately, people started to recognize that this item could be abused on a plethora of different gods. And when abused by these gods, it made the game extremely unfun for those playing against it. I want to emphasize that this is a different level of frustration, and everyone will have their own preferences on what they think is stupid or dumb or cringe or whatever. But there are 2 factors to think about when it comes to Bauble's frustration: how good the item actually is, and how many people get frustrated by it. Going back to the controversy, immediately on Twitter, people started tweeting about the item. One of the most popular tweets being from the Solar Scarab's support, Inbound. Quote, "Bro, fuck this Bauble item. Some gods aren't meant to have 60% cooldown and it breaks the game." Obviously, when he said breaks the game, that is just an exaggeration, and it's not like the game quite literally will break if people build that item. There are also a few clips posted showing people's frustration, and overall there was just a lot of people that agreed that the item was inherently bad for Smite. On the flip side though, there were people that really enjoyed the item. In fact, some people said it's up there with one of the most fun items ever introduced in Smite ever. In fact, the discussion was so widespread that the official Smite Twitter account with over 940,000 followers tweeted, quote, "Sphinx's Bauble is back and will be closely watched for possible balance changes in the second bonus update coming in 2 weeks. Let us know what you think." With many of these comments under this tweet telling them to flat out remove the item. This is significant because Hi-Rez doesn't typically tweet things asking for feedback about a specific item or god. They normally just tweet out updates, sales going on, and then retweet things from the Smite Pro Twitter account. When talking about item balance or god balance or the balance of anything in the game, it's important to look at what SPL is doing with it. SPL has a giant impact on the balance of the game, and all of this discussion was happening before the first set of SPL matches where Bauble was available for play. And when I say that SPL has a giant impact on balance, I don't mean Hi-Rez is sitting there watching SPL and making balance decisions based on what gods are played and what items are built. What I mean by this is that a lot of players will pretty much copy what's happening in SPL. And I think it's fair to assume that the more people are doing something, the more likely it is for Hi-Rez to notice it and take action accordingly. As of this video being made, Cupid has seen a surge in popularity, with one of the big reasons being that Cupid has been played pretty frequently in SPL. But you want to know what's extremely interesting? As of this video being recorded, Bauble hasn't been built a single time in SPL. So because Bauble's not being built in SPL, does this mean that the item isn't good? And if Bauble isn't good, then was the community just overreacting and it actually doesn't need any changes? And this is essentially where the controversy is at as of this video being uploaded. People are outraged because they believe it to be insanely broken on a few characters, as well as it being extremely frustrating to play against. But at the same time, it hasn't really been built in SPL. Before going into my full opinion, I want to discuss a few things. I could make an entire video talking about how SPL affects both ranked and casual play, but for simplicity's sake, I want to go over the 3 different metas in Smite. What's considered good and what's considered bad can quite literally change based on somebody's skill level. So this creates 2 separate metas for players that are pretty skilled at the game and players that aren't skilled at the game. And then there's the third meta, the competitive meta. I have very, very limited competitive experience, so I'm not going to comment on this too much, but I do acknowledge that what's played at a competitive level isn't necessarily reflective of what's good in the other 2 metas. But going back to one of my previous points, people will still copy it regardless. It's also worth noting that Hi-Rez has historically balanced things around high-level feedback. I'd argue that about 90% of the balance changes come directly from what's perceived as good and bad in high-level play. Not saying Hi-Rez doesn't necessarily care about lower elo players, but if people are consistently doing something at a high level and the community interprets this as it being good, then Hi-Rez is typically going to take action. This goes into my final point. Community perception. The way the community perceives something could also affect balance, even if it isn't entirely true. If the community perceives something as extremely good when it's not, then it could still get nerfed, even if objectively it wasn't that good. If the community perceives something as extremely bad, but it's extremely good, then it might get buffed. The community isn't necessarily always right, and sometimes people perceive something that it's not. It's just important to understand that there are many different ways to look at something as well as balance it. And finally, even if you hate the item and think it's one of the worst things ever made, just understand that behind every update, there are real human beings making those decisions. I've seen a lot of pure hatred and toxicity towards the developers following this item's release, and that literally does nothing for the game. If anything, it makes the community look worse. I'm not talking about the comments telling them to remove it, as you could interpret that as constructive criticism. I'm talking about the comments talking about how dumb Hi-Rez is, or how few brain cells people think they have. Just know that there's a line between what's considered toxic and what's considered constructive criticism. One of those does nothing for the game, and the other actually helps Hi-Rez make decisions. I could have ended the video a few minutes ago when I caught everyone up to speed on the current controversy of Bauble, but I don't think that does the situation justice. The reason I talked about what I did after the fact is because I don't think every situation in Smite is black and white. Like I said earlier, there are just so many different ways to look at this, and I think it's important to take everything into account before coming to a conclusion. As for my opinion goes, if we go back to the 2 things I said to consider, I think the community overreacted a little bit when it comes to Bauble's viability, but I do acknowledge that a ton of people are upset. And if people are upset, even if the item isn't necessarily as strong, it's probably worth changing it just to ease that part of the community. If I'm being blunt, I strongly dislike the idea of removing it immediately. Hi-Rez hasn't even gotten the chance to even attempt to balance it, and people are calling for the item to be removed. And like I said earlier, a lot of people enjoy it. Scrolling through Twitter, I've seen so many different suggestions to how Bauble could potentially be balanced to appease everybody. For example, what if the CDR cap was reduced from 60% to 50%? What if the item took away some of your protections? Hell, what if the item even caused your abilities to cast slower like you're in an Oleron ult? So I hope the community allows Hi-Rez to at least try something before jumping to the conclusion that it should be removed from Smite. I could be entirely wrong. Bauble could genuinely be a mistake of an item in Smite, with absolutely no way to balance it to appease everybody. But Bauble has barely been out for over a week. Let's at the very least just give Hi-Rez a chance to change things. Whether you love or hate the item, you can't deny that Bauble has been one of the most controversial items in Season 9. And after the upload of this video, it'll probably get even more controversial. This has been Black Eye, and I hope you guys have a good day.
These are just these. This shit still so cold when it drop, it's gonna be